Everyone. For some reason, I can't get my gallery view up. Right now. That's better. Hello, everyone. Hello, Keith. Hello, Mr. Cute, Sir, Mr. President, King Louis. Lindsay Timmins, Keith in Lincolnshire, and Waleed over there, and Baba C in Washington, D.C. And of course, tonight's stupendous teller, Mr. Keith Rogers. So, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, an assembled company, welcome to the World Storytelling Cafe, and it is Friday. Therefore, it is Stories for Children. Who have we got this week? We have the amazing, the stupendous Mr. Keith Rogers. Over to you, Keith.
Thanks, John. Nice introduction. I like that. And because it's the World Storytelling Cafe, we're going to do a little trip around the world. And we're going to begin in Finland. And it's a story I first came across in the 1970s in the series called Jackanory, where celebrities read a story. And there were various book stories from Finland, stories from Russia, and so on. And this one has stuck with me through time. And it's back in a time when people didn't travel. And Pekka and his mother live on a farm way out from town. And his mother calls him in and she says to him, "It's been a very dry summer and there's not enough food to feed our old cow Kaliki for the winter. So tomorrow you'll have to take her to town and sell her at the market." Now, Pekka was both excited and apprehensive at the same time because he had never been to the town. What an adventure, but also what would happen. So the next morning, hot sunny day, and his mum gave him his broad brimmed hat to keep the sun off, and a neckerchief, a spotted neckerchief, to save his neck getting the sun. And he set off with Kaliki on a string. And he walked and he walked and he walked. And eventually he came to a rise. And there below he could see the town. He could even see the market where the animals were being sold. And between him and the town was a river, a small river, with a bridge over it. And just over the bridge to the right was a copse, a stand of trees. And as he walked down, what he hadn't seen were three rogues standing in amongst the trees. And one of the rogues starts to walk up the road. And as he passes Pekka, he says, "Hello, Hayseed. It's a nice goat you've got there." And he carries on walking. And Pekka's trying to say, "It's my old cow Kaliki. It's not a goat, but you've already walked up the road." And as he approached the bridge, there's a second rogue leaning against the parapet. "Nice goat," he says. "You'll get a pretty penny for that goat in the market." "But it's my old cow Kaliki," he starts to say. "Yeah, you believe what you want to, Hayseed, but that is one handsome goat." Now, by the time the third rogue stepped out of the trees, Pekka is really confused. Is this what town people think? But the rogue offered him a price for his old cow Kaliki. And he said to him, "There's lots of goats being sold at that market today. You won't get that good a price, but I'll give you a decent price." And when Pekka looked at the money, it seemed like a huge amount. He wasn't used to holding coin. And amidst the confusion, he handed over the string and the rogue led Kaliki into the town. And he put the money in his pocket and he walked into the town, and he's looking around amazed at the throngs of people as in the shops, and he can hear the sounds of the market, the cattle market, with all the animals baying away. But when he got to the market, he saw the three rogues selling his old cow Kaliki for 4 times the amount they had given him. Now, he may have been a naive boy from the country, but he was annoyed by this. And he walked away from the market wondering what he could do, for there were 3 of them and only him. How was he to get his revenge? Then he had an idea. And he went into a shop that sold pies, and there were tables outside. And he paid for 4 pies. And then he said to the waiter, I'm going to come in with my friends in a minute and we have a bit of fun. I'm going to spin my hat and say, is everything paid for? Is that okay? And you paid for everything, sir? Of course it is. Then he went along to a cake shop, and in the window was a torque, which is a cheesecake with blueberries on it. And he ordered 4 slices and he paid for them. And then he said to that shopkeeper, I'm going to bring some friends down in a minute. I'm going to spin my hat and say, is everything paid for? Is that okay? And he said, yes, of course. And finally he went to an ice cream parlor and did the same thing. Then he set off to the market, and the 3 rogues walking towards him stiffened because they were expecting a bit of a fight, but they saw a broad grin on his face. And he marched up to them and said, gentlemen, you gave me such a good price for my goat. I'm a bit hungry now. Would you like to join me for a pie? And they all looked at each other and thought, he's even more stupid than we thought. But they followed him and they sat outside the pie shops, and they all sat and ate a pie. And when they were finished, the waiter came over to clear up, and Pika stood up and spun his hat on his finger and said, is everything paid for? And the waiter said, yes, sir, and took away the plates. And the rogues looked at each other, one to the other. But before they could speak, he said, fancy something sweet now. Saw a nice cake shop up the road. Let's try that. And he walked up there and ordered 4 slices of torque. And they were laid out on a plate. And they all ate their fill. And when they'd finished, the waiter came over to clear up. And Pika stood up again and spun his hat on his finger and said, is everything paid for? And the waiter said, it is, sir. And took the plates away. Well, the rogues wanted to know all about this hat. And could they buy it off him? He said, oh, no, I couldn't sell this hat. It was my grandfather's. And as you can see, it's a magic hat. All I have to do is spin it on my finger and say, is everything paid for? And you saw. But anyway, I fancy an ice cream. And off they went. 4 ice creams. They ate their ice creams. The waiter came out to clear away. Pika spun his hat on his fingers and said, is everything paid for? And the waiter bowed and said, yes, sir, and took away the plates. So they tried again to buy they pleaded with him. They took all the money out of their pockets, the money they got for Kaliki, the money was already there, pendants and bracelets, and they put it all on the table. And Pika said, well, you've been very fair with me. It would only be fair for me to fare with you, and I'll sell you my hat. So he put his neckerchief on the floor and he put all the money and jewels into it, and he tied it up and he handed over the hat and he set off down the street to go home. Well, the 3 rogues thought they were in heaven. They went along to the best inn in town and they began to feast, a huge table groaning with meat and vegetables, and then desserts, and then drinks. And then when, in the early evening, the waiter came over with a big long bill, the first rogue stood up confidently and said, is everything paid for? And the waiter said, pardon? And the second rogue took the hat, thinking actually perhaps he hadn't done it properly, and he spun it a bit more nervously and says, is everything paid for? And the waiter's face darkened. Are you making fun of me, sir? He said. And the third rogue snatched the hat and in a panic began to spin it, shouting, is everything paid for? Is everything paid for? Is everything? The waiter snapped his fingers and 2 very large men came out of the kitchen, took them by their collars and led them back into the kitchen where the plates and dishes were piled high to the ceiling, and they began to wash up, and they washed up for the whole night. Meanwhile, Pika had returned home, and his mother was sitting in the kitchen at a big oak table. And Pika put his neckerchief bulging onto the table and opened it out. And his mother looked at this and said, Pika, Pika, you didn't get all that money for our old cow Kaliki. And he said, no, I sold my hat as well. Thank you. Now, with hardly a pause, we're moving to Egypt. Egypt in ancient times, but not the Egypt of Ramesses and Nefertiti, but it is the Egypt of a very wealthy king. His palace was made of marble. There were tapestries on the walls that were jewel encrusted. His wealth was beyond compare, and his pride and joy was his atrium. The atrium, the huge garden within the palace. And he bought plants and birds and fish from all over the world. There was a huge eucalyptus tree in the middle. There were shrubs with exotic flowers on them. The flower beds smelled to the finest scents. A huge pond held huge carp that swam around. And there was a big stone bench in the middle where he would sit and he'd listen to the birds and he'd smell the scent. And he'd open his eyes and look around at his favorite place. Now, it happened that one day he was out riding with his entourage and he passed a small village. And on the edge of the village was a field. And in the middle of the field was a tree. And halfway up the tree was an iguana. And the king stopped and marveled. An iguana. Didn't even know what it was called. He had never seen one before in his entire life. And he immediately thought how magnificent it would look in the tree in his atrium. He would sit on his stone bench and he would smell the scents and listen to the birds and look up at the iguana. So he offered a bag of gold to anyone who could get the iguana down out of the tree and bring it to his palace. A bag of gold. The strong came first, trying to shake the tree for the iguana to fall out of it. The iguana clung onto its branch and looked down at them with disdain. Sometimes there were 3 or 4 shaking the tree, to no effect. Then came the athletes. They climbed the tree. The iguana, seeing them coming, sighed and went further up the tree until it was on a branch that a human could not bear. Finally came the clever people. They tried to talk the iguana down. They tried to flatter it and say how wonderful it looked and imagine living in a palace. It turned away, not interested. Now, as all this was going on, this became a source of entertainment for the village. For each time a group or individual came to capture the iguana, the people would gather and cheer. And then when they failed, they would jeer and laugh. And they were gathered after some clever people had tried to persuade the iguana down, when a young man arrived next to the tree. And seeing a peasant with no shoes, a bag over his shoulder, a goat and a dog on a piece of string, they all laughed even more. How was this boy going to persuade the iguana out of the tree with a dog and a goat and whatever was in the bag? But he took no notice of their jeers. He took a pot out of his bag. He collected up sticks and made a fire. And then from the bag, he found some oats and some water, and he stirred it up and left it. Then he tied the goat to one post and the dog to another post, and he went and fetched from the edge of the clearing some lush green grass. The people watched, intrigued. The iguana, back on his branch, looked down, intrigued as well. But the boy carried on as though no one was taking any notice of him. When the porridge was ready, he scooped it into a wooden bowl and took it over to the goat. The goat, one sniff, turned its head away. He came back. He took the grass over to the dog. And the dog sniffed the grass and turned his head away. Then he went to the goat again, and then the dog again, and the goat and the dog, and the people watched amazed. What was he thinking of? But the iguana was becoming frustrated, and the iguana called down, "Give the porridge to the dog and the grass to the goat." Feigning stupidity, the boy said, "What? What do you mean?" And he took the porridge over to the goat again and the grass over to the dog. The iguana was furious. "Can't you see? They don't like it. The goat should have the grass. The dog should have the porridge." "What?" said the boy. "What? I don't understand what you mean. What?" And the iguana, furious, climbed down out of the tree, went over, grabbed the bowl, took it to the dog, who started eating, took the grass to the goat, who started eating, and as he turned round to go there, the boy snatched him up and put him in his bag and pulled the tie. There's a bit of a rumpus as the iguana realised he'd been captured, but the boy flung him over his shoulder, grabbed his goat, grabbed his dog, and set off toward the palace. He set off toward the palace, left the goat and the dog, and he went up to the guard. And the guard, seeing a peasant approaching, said, "Not today, no beggars, thank you." He said, "No, I'm not a beggar." He said, "I've got the iguana in this bag, the one the king wants so much." And the king came down to the atrium, and the boy was shown in. "Show me," said the king. So he opened the bag, and the furious iguana jumped out, splashed through the pond, frightened the fish. The birds flew up into the air, terrified. Plants were scattered here, there, and everywhere. It ran up the eucalyptus tree and settled on a branch. And then it sniffed. Eucalyptus tree smelled quite nice, actually. And it chewed a leaf. Oh, well, actually, one tree's the same as another. The iguana was quite happy, settled on its new tree. And the king called for the bag of gold to be brought out. And he bought his. "You may now marry my daughter," he said, "the princess." And the man was shocked. "But we have to clean you up first." So they took him away. I took him away, got rid of his peasant's clothes, washed him, put fine clothes, and set him back into the atrium. And he was embarrassed as the princess was brought in. And she sat by him. And he said to her, "It's okay. I know I'm a peasant and I come from the village. You don't have to marry me." And she said, "Well, you're obviously a very clever fellow," she said, "and I have always known that my father would choose who I should marry. So I think that I'm quite happy to marry you. And the boy was shocked, for he had his bag of gold already. But the next week they were married, and it won't surprise you to know that they lived happily ever after. Thank you. I have to say, I do like a happy ending. And these kings often offer their daughters as rewards, so it's quite nice when they find a nice chap. But now we're heading south. Now, Baba Z knows these stories, the Anansi stories, and I was first introduced to them by families of West Indian origin. And I thought that's where they came from, therefore, until I found out as time passed that unsurprisingly they come from West Africa and Ghana in particular. And this is a story, again, we go back way, way in time, and it was when the dog and the rabbit were friends. And the rabbit had a lovely long bushy tail, and they would play together from morning until night. They'd run around in circles chasing each other's tails. They'd run up through the woods. They'd splash in the puddles. They'd jump in the water. They were two great friends. And you can imagine if they were children, there'd be those children at school or always together at playtime and lunchtime and walk back and forth to school. There was a perfect friendship. And that was why Anansi the spider, watching, liked to cause disruption. And as the dog and the rabbit were playing, Anansi called out. And Anansi said, at the quay, there is a boat, a ship, and it's going to Treasure Island. The dog was beside himself. The dog ran round the field in circles shouting, I want to go to Treasure Island. 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 And the rabbit stood there waiting because she could see on Anansi's face that there was some catch to this. But, said Anansi triumphantly, to go on the boat to Treasure Island, you have to be an animal with horns. The dog's face dropped. I want to go to Treasure Island. 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 But the rabbit had been thinking and said, well, actually, if we go into the woods and get a broad leaf and some twigs and some vine to tie it on with, we could look like animals that have horns. Who will notice? The dog brightened and ran around the field a few times shouting, we're going to Treasure Island. We're going to Treasure Island. They got into the woods and they found their broad leaves thick, and they made holes in to put the twigs. But then they couldn't put them on. They slid around. And so the rabbit said, wait. I'll put yours on to the dog, and you put mine on, and it'll be easier. So the dog sat carefully like this, and the rabbit put the leaf on its head and poked the twigs through so they stuck up, and then got the vine and twined it round and round under his chin and tied it and made sure that it was pretty solid. It wasn't going to slurp one way or the other. And the dog was delighted, and the dog went over to a pool and looked in, and there was his reflection, looking just like an animal with horns, and he was delighted, and the rabbit waited patiently. But as they were waiting, they heard a sound. Deep, deep. The sound of a ship about to leave. Without thinking, the dog ran out of the woods, down across the fields, down to the jetty, and jumped on the boat just before it was going to leave. The rabbit running after the dog, holding the vine and the twigs and the broad leaf, shouting, "What about me? What about me?" But the dog had forgotten the rabbit completely. The rabbit was furious and ran to the top of a hill by the river. And as the boat came past, the rabbit called out, "There's an animal on your boat who hasn't got horns." And the dog started to panic, but no one else heard. The rabbit's voice was swept away in the wind. The boat carried on down the river. The rabbit ran to the next hill. "There's an animal on your boat, Captain. Hasn't got real horns." And the boatswain looked around because he heard a voice, but he couldn't make out what it was saying. The dog was starting to panic and sweating, his tongue hanging out. And the rabbit ran to the third hill and took a huge breath and shouted in the biggest booming voice she could, "Captain, Captain, there's an animal on your boat who hasn't got real horns." And the boatswain heard this time, and he went to see the captain, and the captain said, we better test this." So the animals were all lined up. The bull, boatswain pulled his horns like that. No, they're okay. The cow, the goat, the unicorn, the rhino, all the while getting closer and closer to the dog. As the boatswain was nearly there, the dog panicked and jumped over the side of the boat. With a great splash, he landed in the water and paddled toward the bank. And the rabbit on the hill watched him coming towards him across the water. And when the rabbit saw the dog's face and his growling teeth, he knew that the dog was angry. And as the dog climbed out of the water, the rabbit turned and ran. And she ran and she ran, and growling and barking, the dog ran after her. And just as she was about to escape into her hole, the dog grabbed her tail in his teeth. But it came off, and the rabbit was safe down her rabbit hole. And the dog held the tail in his teeth. And that is why, to this day, rabbits have tiny tails, and dogs are always chasing rabbits. Thank you. Now we are off to Australia. And I came across this story. My son lives in Perth, and my wife and I tell our grandchildren in Australia stories, but we found this storybook in Australia, and it's from the old Dreamtime. Tidalik was a frog, a big frog. Well, he's more than a big frog, he was enormous. In fact, Tidalik was as big as a mountain. So that when he woke up one day and he was thirsty, he slurped up the water from a puddle. Then he went, slurped up the water from a billabong. He slurped up the water from a lake. And finally, he drank the entire river. And he sat like a mountain, bloated, eyes popping, the odd drip coming from his mouth. But now Australia was dry. How could that be? The animals watched as the plants began to wither. There was no water for them to drink. What were they to do? They gathered in front of this huge mountain-like frog, and they asked him, please, to release the water. He'd had a good drink. Now could they have their water back? For the land was red and parched. Had no effect at all. The bulging eyes were unmoved, and the animals talked amongst themselves. The kangaroo, the lizard, the lyrebird, the wombat, the emu, even the eel was there, swept away from the river. And then the wise wombat had an idea. The wise wombat said, perhaps if we make Tiddalik laugh, then when he laughs, the water will come gushing out, and the lakes and the billabongs and the river will be full again, and the plants will grow. And the animals thought this was a great idea, and the kookaburra flew up into a tree, ready to take part. So first the kangaroo, being the biggest, began to hop back and forth over the emu, getting closer and closer to its head, so the animals looked and laughed as the emu ducked each time. But Tiddalik was unmoved. He just looked solemnly on. The emu tried to imitate other birds in a comic fashion, like we see a ventriloquist do. And the other animals thought this was great. They'd never seen the emu put on a show before, but Tiddalik just looked at them mournfully. The lizard did a jig. It was on its hind legs, and it began to dance about. And the animals thought this was excellent. And they turned around and they looked at Tiddalik, expecting at least a chuckle, but nothing came. The kookaburra, waiting patiently in the tree, began to tell its famous jokes and make its famous laugh. And the animals thought the jokes were so good, they were rolling around with laughter, splitting their sides. And as they rolled around, they looked up at Tiddalik for the first sign of amusement, and they saw none. The eel squirmed forward, and they all stopped and watched. They didn't know the eel much, because he'd come out of the lake. What was the eel going to do? And the eel began to dance horizontally, as you would expect. Well, it was quite a nice dance, and they began to tap their feet along to the obvious rhythm of the eel's dance. And he danced and he danced and he danced. He got faster and faster and faster and faster and faster, till in fact he was vertical. But an eel shouldn't be vertical. And it soon went horribly wrong as his head flapped and came down and his tail went up, and then somehow he tied himself in a knot, which has probably got a strange nautical name because it looked really complicated. And in this knot he rolled over the floor, and he's still trying to dance, and the animals are laughing, but they stopped laughing when they heard a rumble. And they looked at Tiddalik, and Tiddalik was looking at the poor eel tied in this complicated nautical knot on the floor. And there was a rumble from way inside him. And the rumble got louder and louder and rose until the rumble reached his mouth and came out as a guffaw. And the water poured out and filled the billabongs and the lakes and the rivers. And this was how, in Dreamtime, the eel saved Australia. Thank you. Finally, my final story. We're coming to Ireland. We're coming to Ireland at a time when, well, Michael McGinty was a carpenter. And at that time, if you're in your hometown, if you couldn't find work, you had to travel. And he moved through the countryside with his bag with his tools in and another bag with a few personal things in. And he'd get work every now and then, mending a gate or a fence or perhaps something bigger. Sometimes he paid well. Sometimes all he got was a bed for the night and a dinner. Sometimes he slept in a barn. But he always got something and he was quite happy. And on this day, he'd been working. He'd been working on a couple of houses in the town that had broken fences and gates that needed repairing. So he had a few coins in his hand. And he decided to go and buy a pint and a pie in the local inn. And he sat in a corner, for he was a quiet man, and supped his pint and ate his pie. When he was sitting there quietly, Finn McCarthy, the farmer, came strolling in for his lunchtime drink, for he'd been to market. And the barman, pouring his pint, looked over at Michael McGinty and said, "You know what we've got here? We have Mike McGinty, the finest storyteller in all of Ireland." Shh. And Finn thought, this is a coup. This is brilliant. If I take him home tonight, he can do a couple of jobs. There's always jobs to be done on the farm, a bit of carpentry. But then we can give him a dinner and he could tell us a story. And we'll tell everyone in the village for the next year that we've had Michael McGinty, the finest storyteller in all of Ireland, in our house. And this is the story he told us. And people will hang on our every word. Won't that be excellent? So he went and sat by Michael McGinty with his drink and said, "Oh, I hear you're a carpenter looking for a bit of work." He said, "Yeah, I'm Michael McGinty, the carpenter. I'm traveling for work." He said, "Well, I've got several jobs back on the farm. And if you come back with me and get those jobs done, there'll be a meal and a bed for you for the night." And Michael McGinty thought this was just what he wanted. So when they'd finished his pie and his drink, they set off for the farm. And sure enough, there was a gate near the barn that needed mending and a fence that looked a bit rickety. Meanwhile, Finn had gone in and told his wife, "Guess what we've got? Our guest is Michael McGinty, the finest storyteller in all of Ireland." And she thought the same as her husband. She would be telling all her friends that they had the greatest storyteller in all of Ireland living with them for a night. And he told them this story, and she would tell them word for word, and they would hang on her every word. They couldn't wait for when the work was finished, and he came and sat in the kitchen. Finn McCarthy filled up a jug of ale and said, "Well, Michael, how about, before we have dinner, how about you tell us a story?" Michael McGinty looked at them and said, "Tell you a story? I'm Michael McGinty, the carpenter. I don't have a story within me." There was a horrible silence in the room, the disappointment that you could almost touch. Finn's wife picked up a bucket and said, "Well, you must make yourself useful then and go down the well and fill this bucket with water." And Mike, bemused at this manner she was talking to him, went off with the bucket. And he lowered it into the well and he pulled it up, and there it was. He put it on the floor, but as he put it down, a wind blew up, a wind that took him off his feet. And he landed with a thump. And when he looked up, he was in a different place. And he looked around, and there was a hall and he could hear there were people in the hall. So he thought, oh, I'll go and find out how to get back to the farm. And he went in the hall, and he could see there was consternation everywhere. People in their sets ready to dance, but someone was saying, well, no music, no dance, no music, no dance. And then a woman turned round and said, we're saved. Here is Michael McGinty, the finest fiddle player in all of Ireland. Michael McGinty said, I'm the big Michael McGinty, the carpenter. I'm Michael McGinty, the carpenter. I don't have a tune in me, but someone shoved a fiddle into his hand and a bow, and he began to play. And he began to play jigs and reels, and the dancers danced and they laughed and cheered. And after each dance, they handed him a glass of wine to celebrate. And the room was hot with dancers. And when it finished, they all trooped out and went into the church next door. And Michael followed to try and find out the way back to the farm. And he got into the church, and again there was consternation. Down by the altar, people talking, the groom and his best man looking around. And then a woman piped up and said, we're saved. Here is Michael McGinty, the finest priest in all of Ireland. I'm Michael McGinty, the carpenter, he said. I don't have a holy word within me. But before he knew where he was standing at the lectern, and the wedding march struck up on the organ, and the bride was brought down proudly by her father. And the groom looked across at her, and she looked at him. And without realizing how he did it, Michael McGinty began the wedding service, and the place was hushed. And finally he said, you may kiss the bride. I pronounce you man and wife. And the congregation cheered. Totally bemused, he watched everyone process out of the church and back into the hall, which now was set with tables and food along the back, and the long table where the family of the bride and groom sit, and the bride and the groom sitting in the middle. And he was given yet another glass of wine, and he said, I must go. I must go. And they said, you can't go yet. You can't go yet. How can Michael McGinty, the finest bard in all of Ireland, go without reciting a poem? He said, a poem? I'm Michael McGinty, the carpenter. I don't have a rhyme within me. But the place went silent. Without realizing why, he began to speak. And he spoke in iambic pentameter and stanzas. And he spoke of love and marriage. And he spoke of the family and children. And there was that wonderful silence where people are hanging on his every word. And he heard a sniff as the bride's father blew his nose and wiped a tear from his eye. And when he had finished, a great cheer went up, and he bowed low and walked out of the door. And having had several glasses of wine, which he wasn't used to, when the fresh air hit him, he slumped back onto the verge. And when he shook his head and looked up, there was the well and the bucket. He didn't know what to say. He picked up the bucket, he went back in through the back door, placed it in the kitchen, and went and sat at the table. Finn and his wife, still grumpy from their disappointment. Finn's wife put a dish in front of him, one chop, couple of potatoes, couple of parsnips, couple of carrots. There you go, she said. At least you brought the water in. He said, you won't believe what happened to me. He said, a great wind blew me up into the air, and I found myself in a hall. And there I was, playing for the dancers. The look on their faces changed as he related the story of the best fiddler in Ireland and the best priest in Ireland. And finally, the bard, having everyone listening in the palm of his hand almost. And he didn't realise their faces were brightening. Finn's wife took his plate away and gave him another chop and lots more vegetables. They were so delighted at his story, and he got a flagon of ale, and they all sat and chatted for the evening. And the next day, when he was ready to leave, they watched him go down the path, thinking of the story they would tell to all the other visitors when Michael McGinty, the greatest storyteller in all of Ireland, came to stay. Thank you.
That was fantastic, Keith.
Thank you, John. Thank you, John.
Round the world with wise fools.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
But such stories give me hope.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. They're some of my favorite stories, I have to say.
No, they were great. They were great. Thank you. No, so we need the litmus test. Cute Sir, Mr. President King Louis Lindsay Timmins, are you there? And so what did you think of tonight's stories?
It is incredible.
Thank you. That is the correct answer.
Praise indeed. Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
And thank you for the stories. Thank you, Waleed, for flying the magic carpet. And what do we actually tomorrow at midday? We've got a special on, and I've got to look up the name of the person who's running it.
Nara? What's her name?
Narika Agarawal is noon snapshot. So I think it's going to be personal stories.
Yeah.
And then next Friday we've got the spinner from Greek with stories. So that's going to be a treat for us. Hello, Vita. Hello, Keith. Hello, Baba C. And goodbye to you all, actually, because what were you going to say, Louis?
I'm not here next week.
Oh, that's okay. Well, you can watch it on catch up, can't you?
Yeah, I will do.
So, are you going anywhere wonderful?
Yes, we are. Yeah.
Where are you going?
We go to Cape Verde.
Really?
Yes,
fantastic. Have yourself a wonderful time.
And my mum is nervous.
Well,
that's right.
I haven't been away for 20 years, John.
Well, that's okay. It'll be even more of a treat after 2 decades.
Yes.
It'll be even more of a treat. So I shall be doing next week. I'm away for 2 weeks, but I shall be doing the programs. I'm going to Romania on Monday for
lovely.
Oh, nice.
a couple of weeks.
A minute.
Yeah. So
we'll go in a moment.
So we're all travelling, apart from Baba C, who's actually in Washington DC. You can't move out from there because you're not allowed back. That's not even joking.
No, not at the moment.
Yeah, well, no, have a wonderful time, Louis and Louis's mum. Have a wonderful, wonderful time.
We will.
Right.
And you too.
Thank you. And Keith in Lincolnshire. How is it in the flatlands?
Yeah, it's been quite good some days, but a bit cool today. But that
It's
cold,
a bit chilly at the moment. So
yeah, it blows off the sea. Yeah.
So Vita, is it chilly in Switzerland?
I think she's in Australia.
No.
Hello. Yes, it was springy. It was very springy. Hello, everyone.
Vita?
It was very springy for one day, and everybody ran out into their gardens and got their feet dirty and talked to the worms and everything, and then it started snowing again.
Yes, yeah, I think it's a bit up and down. I think it's been warm in Romania this week. I think it's going to be cold again next week. So, Babasi, Avita is spending a little time in Europe before she returns to Australia, as it's a very long distance, and she has grandchildren scattered around the world.
She
Oh,
does.
so-
She's a global couch surfer now.
Yeah,
Evita
and
Toast.
no better occupation. So anyway, well, hopefully some of you will join us tomorrow. Well, I hope to, and next Friday the spinner, and have a wonderful weekend, everybody.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.
Oh
Bye.
yeah, and
Bye.
on Sunday week, not this Sunday, but Sunday week will be our 5th anniversary of the World Storytelling
Oh, that-
Cafe. It'll be 5 years since our
Sorry,
first.
my
book club.
audience want to join in.
Hello, audience.
So Lorna and
Lorna,
Lenny are
Hi there.
Lorna and Lydia. Well, wonderful.
well-behaved audience.
No, they were very good. They didn't interrupt you at all.
No, they didn't.
Thank you
But-
for being there, audience. Lovely people.
They're wonderful. Audiences are important. Right. Probably most important. Taffy says if talking was more important than listening, we'd have 2 mouths and 1 ear. But that's something entirely
He
different.
does.
So less of this nonsense. I shall say farewell to all of you.
Bye.
Bye.
Take care.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Right.
Bye.
Right.
Until the next time. To be
Right.
continued.
Bye. Have a lovely holiday to Mr. Louis and Mum.
I will.
Bye.
I will.
And Evita, my family loved the story. Evita did a story that ended up talking about my great-grandmother, my
Oh, yeah?
great-great-grandmother on my mother's side, and it matched her perfectly.
Oh,
And she didn't know me.
oh my goodness!
Yes. Louis, you have a great time.
Yeah, I am. So I will let you know what's going on. And I'm going to swim with sharks. Hello. Babsy.
See out. See you next time.